Right. So, it's no secret that I was not the biggest fan of Arcane. I liked the show overall, but I did find it a little boring and a little forgettable. I had to rewatch the entire thing to make this video, just so I could remember some characters' names. My main issue with it being that it was overly negative for the sake of making it come across as deeper than it ever actually was. I'm not the biggest fan of what you might call moral hounds. I don't know how else to call them, but it's characters that exist mostly to be beaten up upon so that you feel bad so you feel bad for them, and then, shocker of all shocks, the dog starts biting people.
It's a puppy. Isn't this puppy adorable? You should get attached to this puppy. Oh no, it's dead. You should feel bad.
You know, like, you beat a puppy and then the puppy starts biting people. That's not a huge shock. The thing that I think separates humans and what makes a truly human story is when somebody can be beaten down and still rise up a better person. Or they can still overcome the bad things that have happened in their past. A character that externalizes all their pain and gives it up to the world is a lot less interesting to the character that grabs hold of that and says, no, I'm responsible. You can't have my pain. I just find the former kind of boring, which I don't think that Arcane was divorced from the latter, but that wasn't the main focus. The main focus of Arcane was very much, following Jinx's story and her descent into madness, which again, I just don't find that interesting. But whatever, I did like Arcane in the end, despite what some people would insinuate, but that does leave me in kind of an unenvious position right now that I have to defend it against rapturous praise. Yeah, so I came across this video titled, How Arcane Does Moral Ambiguity, which surprised the hell out of me because the lack of moral ambiguity is something I actually liked in the series. And from having watched the video, I can tell from the intro the mistake that the guy is making.
What was going through your head when you watched this moment? How many separate feelings, like mutually exclusive feelings, were you experiencing all at once? Were you happy for Jinx? Because I was. Even though she was sad, even though she was devastated, even though her life was falling apart, I was happy for her for finally embracing who she is. And I also felt guilty for being happy because it came at the expense of all these other characters I'd grown so attached to. I knew exactly what had to happen here, why it had to happen. Everything felt right, but I also felt lost. I felt catharsis, but I also felt hopelessness. And I really think that sums up the power of a morally ambiguous story.
Right. That's not moral ambiguity, or at least not a coherent definition of moral ambiguity. It'd be difficult to say with exactness what moral ambiguity actually means, as there's no set definition, and a lot of people have differing understandings of what it means when something is morally ambiguous. If you were to judge it mostly by how people tend to use it, moral ambiguity is when a character that's hot does something evil. That seems like a pretty stupid definition, though. So what I'm going to say is morally ambiguous is moral ambiguity is when different moral systems give you different moral outcomes. So I'm going to be really simplifying three big moral systems that I think encompass most moral discussion, but with the awareness that I'm not getting too deep into any of these things and that it is just a layman summarizing something that he heard in a lecture one time. Okay? Okay. So the first moral system is consequentialism. And that's basically exactly what it sounds like. It's that that something is good or bad, whether or not it has good or bad consequences. Was America dropping an atomic bomb on Japan good or bad? Well, it caused them to surrender and stopped an invasion from being necessary, so a consequentialist would say that it was good. Unless they're tanky, but again, I'm assuming rationality here. The other big moral system would be something like deontology. That just more or less means a moral duty. Something is good or bad if the action is good or bad. So killing another person is always bad. There are strict rules that need to be followed, and being moral is following those rules. This is very much your standard lawful good type person. These are the rules and we must follow them. And doing so to the best of our ability, that's what makes us good. But going back to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, bombing killing people is wrong, so of course killing thousands of people would be wrong. This was an evil action. And the final kind is a virtue ethics, which is a lot more complicated than the other two and very difficult to summarize. But in comparison to the other two, it's less concerned with moral actions and more concerned with moral people. A virtue ethicist isn't concerned with the trolley problem necessarily. A virtue ethicist would be concerned with being the type of person who can make good calls on the trolley problem, which I know that sounds like a meaningless distinction, but it does matter to them a lot. A good statement for virtue ethicists would be choose your path and walk it well. And that tends to be a motif that reoccurs when you read from Buddhists and Stoic and Cynic texts in particular. You have the path that you are set down upon, and you have to do that as best as you possibly can. Epictetus was born a slave, and he lived his life mostly as a slave. But you know how people mostly describe the man? As pretty freaking jovial. He was a person who was born into servitude, came to understand that, you know what, there are things I control, there are things I can't control, and living well within the confines of what I have, that's ultimately what matters in the end. Not any specific moral action, but being in general a moral person. Usually by taking the other two big moral systems and mixing it in what ways they find reasonable. This is easily the most fluid of these moral systems. I mean, one is you just follow the law.
I am the law!
And the other is just make sure good things happen.
Well, if I know anything about which number is bigger than the other number.
And this one is a lot more, well, you have to balance everything, and you have to try and be a courageous person, but not necessarily courageous in just fighting. You have to be courageous enough to sometimes just not do anything. Sometimes you might want to join in on the blood feud, and you know that that's wrong, so you have to have a degree of temperance. It's a good example of a character that's very virtuous would be someone like Uncle Iroh from Avatar: The Last Airbender. He is completely content with his life in any situation, and his ethical guidelines seem mostly about maximizing that. Any character that you would quantify as Zen is typically some that is very much in that vein of virtue ethics. Okay, half-assed ethics lesson aside, do any of these sound like they give justification for blowing up a building full of people? From a consequentialist point of view, what the hell do you think is going to happen after you do this? The city of Piltover is now going to crack down incredibly hard upon the poorer citizens of, I forgot the name of the other city. So consequentially, you just killed a bunch of people and made everything worse for everyone around you. No, it's not moral from that prescription. From a deontological point of view, I don't think there's a moral system that really... I don't know how you could justify a moral system that says, I should be able to kill whoever I want. How? Why? And can't they just respond in kind if that's your moral system? Yeah, hot takes of all hot takes. Your older sibling punching you once does not give you the permission to blow up a building. Daniel, you should feel lucky that I feel that way. And finally, is this a virtuous action? Fucking no. This is very much not living in good spirit. This was an unjust, unwise action that was also cowardly and intemperate. Which just so happens to be the exact opposite of all the things the Stoics say is good. So no, there's no moral ambiguity in Arcane, especially in this scene. And I'm tired of moral ambiguity being used as an excuse to hide the fact that people are lazy writers. Yeah, God forbid you come up with a few principles and stand by them. No, let's just make everything a morally ambiguous quagmire and not stand up for anything. So, wait, if this wasn't morally ambiguous, why were people feeling so conflicted here? Well, that's simple, because you confused moral ambiguity with cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a term used online very frequently, mostly in arguments, and mostly incorrectly. But what cognitive dissonance is just an uncomfortable feeling you have when your expectations about the world don't match the reality of the world. So if you thought Arcane was some morally ambiguous magnum opus, and I come in and say it's really not, the feeling you get when somebody disagrees with your assumption about what Arcane actually ends up being, that is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is just the feeling you get when your expectations don't match reality. How people reduce the dissonance is the important thing. So in Arcane, it does a good job of creating cognitive dissonance here at the end here, because you've seen Jinx's journey. You understand this character and you feel sympathy for her. That's why it feels so bad when she does this thing that you know is wrong. She blows up a building full of people and you know that's wrong. But you feel sympathy for her because she was just a kid and she didn't have the best dad in the world, and you gotta feel bad for her. So how do you choose to reduce that dissonance? Well, one way is you could say that this is a completely morally ambiguous action. It's not, but you could say that. Another way of doing so would just be what I did in this situation and go, just because I like someone and just because I feel sympathy for them doesn't mean that they make good actions. There's a difference between someone who's likable and somebody who's good. So I reduced dissonance by having a, I think, far more accurate summation of what the series was going for, and I should just probably look up the guy's name. Shichni? Is that how you pronounce it? I don't fucking care. Reduce the dissonance by inventing this entire backstory that this is all secretly some sort of morally ambiguous quagmire. Most of the time when somebody says something is morally ambiguous, it's not morally ambiguous. Morally ambiguous things are defended on their moral merits. You don't have to call them morally ambiguous. Having said that, the rest of this video does a really good job of how you can make people feel cognitive dissonance here at the end. So there is a lot of value in this video. It's just you have to mentally adjust the title and everything else to not be moral ambiguity, but cognitive dissonance. But, I mean, as the virtue ethics might say, you're doing a really good job walking someone else's path. And finally, you know, that's a good thing that Arcane is not this morally ambiguous thing. That's one of the things I liked about it. The actual moral theme of Arcane seems to be something a lot better than just going, sometimes people don't agree on morality. I know, right? Think about this. In the end of the series, who's in a good place? Is it the ends justify the means inventor guy, whose name I've completely forgotten, the unvirtuous Jinx and her equally terrible sister, or Judge Dredd over here, whose name, again, I cannot remember. I watched this series again last night and I'm still blanking a lot of characters' names, I'm sorry. No, the characters that actually ended up in a good place near the end of this series were Echo and Heimeldinger. And what these two people are in this series are the principal idealists. Heimeldinger really obviously cares about his city and everything, and when he gets booted off his council, what's the first thing he does? Well, he goes and tries to right the wrongs as best he can, so he's a very virtuous person. Similarly, Echo has that same kind of I'm going to help in however I can and give people something worth living for. It's worth noting these two start at like the complete opposite ends of this society, and they meet in the middle somewhere, and their relationship is the most fucking interesting thing in this series, and there's maybe 2 minutes of it. So the moral theme Arcane seems to be making, and if this was a mistake, then task failed successfully, is that virtue ethics, that's the way to go. The ends justify the means is always going to create more problems. Being unvirtuous is going to make you really not a good person. You're going to hate yourself. And being too concerned with following the rules is going to, not put you in a really great spot either. So that's why I am saying that I'm defending this series against its rapturous praise. Because I do not think it is making the point that this video seems to be implying morality. It's actually making a much more brave and a lot more interesting point.
Perfection and power are overrated. I think you are very wise to choose happiness and love. Sometimes life is like this dark tunnel. You can't always see the light at the end of the tunnel. But if you just keep moving, you will come to a better place.